Okay, so we're back with our third part in this series here. So again, we took this element that had some CSS that needed change, and actually by untangling some of the CSS, we ended up reducing the complexity of the JavaScript involved, improving the accessibility and the payload, the time it would take to load this because of dependency tree. And we've actually now left off at a point where we can take what previously was a polymer element with some polymerisms, and we can convert it into a lit element. Now, this is one of the things that really sold our team on using web components was this ability right here. So imagine we've had this out in production for a year. It's largely in PolymerElement. There's parts of it that are lit element, parts of it that are vanilla JavaScript. And by that I mean just using the HTML element subclass that is baked into the browser natively. So imagine this is out in production. And now we're in this situation where we've worked on this change and we've gone, oh, it's reduced in scope, it's reduced in complexity. Now we don't need all the training wheels that PolymerElement provides. Let's use a more efficient base class in order to deliver that. Something that's gonna have a lot more longevity and ultimately what we're gonna get to, like a smaller payload for the entire page. So the easiest way to do that is to switch to lit element. Now, lit element is also by the Polymer team. And this is definitely a confusion that a lot of people have. But lit and Polymer are not the same thing. They both can output web components. And so that's the important thing. Polymer elements and lit elements can play nice together, even though they have different rendering conventions, even though they have different ways that you do event binding, different ways you define properties, all that good stuff. So lit element is a lot smaller and faster than PolymerElement is. So PolymerElement has been great training wheels for, goodness, like 4 years that it's existed. But the goal of PolymerElement was basically to fade away, and so that you would need a lot less in order to do the things web components now can do natively in the DOM. So lit element is the next metamorphosis of that. There's no upgrade path. There's no like run this command and now it's a lit element. There will not be a Polymer 4. There is Polymer 3 is feature complete. It's just some very minor bug fixes every now and then, and that doesn't mean it's going away. It means those things are built and they work, forever. And now, if you want to convert them to lit element, well, then go ahead when it makes sense and you're ready. So it really fits in nicely with workflow. So again, let's look at what a just very basic lit element looks like. It's got to render something to the screen, and you can go through the tutorial that they have and see how one would do this, but effectively you have to import something to render and process HTML and lit element instead of PolymerElement. So I'm going to pull that in. Now I like to directly reference the JS files just because of the way that I do some build routine stuff. You'll see in a lot of examples that people use that they won't use this full way of referencing the class in question. In fact, like if this is pulling in definition I knew I already had in a paste bin. So this is commonly what I'll put at the top of my elements that are lit element based. So I pull in lit element as a subclass and HTML and CSS, and this is another difference between lit element and PolymerElement. PolymerElement, you just render everything out. You see how the styles are just put here. Lit elements, the styles are pulled in separately so that they can be processed at 2 different times. It's much more efficient in the end. Not going to get into all the reasons why. So if I need to convert this from a PolymerElement to a lit element, the first thing is, let's drop PolymerElement out of there. And now I need to say, instead of extends PolymerElement, it's going to be extends lit element, because that's what it is. While we're here, let's get rid of some of these comments that I never fully implemented. Space that out. Make it a little bit more readable. There we go. Okay. So now it doesn't have template as its callback function for rendering. It's got render. So we're going to say render. And then you can see it has same tick marks with HTML, except now HTML is a function coming in from lit element. Now the styles have to be done differently. So we're going to look at the way that lit says it does styles. Now I'll have to update my properties, but we'll get to that in a minute. So you can see render, import CSS, there it is, styles. So it actually has the ability to import an array of styles, and so I prefer that syntax, which is slightly different, but let me find an example that I always use here. There we go. Static get styles, and then I end up having my return block. Looks more like this. So now I'm going to put my CSS in here. So instead of it being in a style block, and we can see this in the documentation on the LitElement website, go to static get styles, it returns CSS. Now I'm returning an array of potential CSS. This will just set it up for some future proofness later on. It's not required. So I'm going to remove style from there because that wouldn't render, it wouldn't do the CSS styling that way. It would actually sanitize it out. Okay, so now I've got styles pulled in the way that LitElement wants to. I'm not doing anything crazy here. I've just got CSS variables. It'll still be happy about that. One area you do have to watch for is Polymer allowed you to use a syntax like this, where you can do @apply. That's no longer supported in LitElement, even though it claims it is. I haven't had success with actually implementing that. Whoops, cancel. Okay, so styles are converted over. The render function is going to be the exact same way. However, the thing that's going to change is the data binding, and we'll see that in the properties itself. So if we go to the properties section of LitElement's documentation, we can see that you use template literal syntax for your properties. So I'm going to convert these over to this first and then work backwards from there as far as updating this, because this block changes as well. So instead of, and this is where you get into made up conventions. So Polymer made up this convention that this would be data binding. Well, this is slightly made up, but actually kind of not really. So LitElement is saying, well, if you're going to do data binding, it should be done this way. And I say it's made up, but not really, because this is an actual convention, right? This is never going to be adopted by the DOM or like by the browser vendors, but this has a really good chance of actually having longevity, you know, and by longevity, I'm saying 3 to 5 years from now, when the browser vendors have said, okay, look, so we're starting to do web components more, and I say that because Apple just rolled out 50 in production to all Apple devices. Like, these things aren't going anywhere. They're expanding in usage. So Apple has a spec proposal that is around this and the template tag actually being native things that you could just run a JavaScript function and it would refresh the data binding in. Now that's going to take a long time to hash out, but this is part of why I say that LitElement is more future-proof than PolymerElement. Because PolymerElement is built on the DOM, like, it's not going to go away. It's built on a web component definition. It still meets the spec. It's not going away, but this has a better chance of someday that we get to something even smaller than LitElement, and maybe it doesn't require this HTML processor class. Like, that's the way the browser works. So I also have one here, so I'll have to do a this.title. And then this $ convention is something that Polymer had. Now it's replaced with a period and then whatever this is. This is an attribute bind. And I might need to do it for these too. We're not going to put it in it first, and we'll just see if it works. And then change it later. Also, I don't pass an image down anymore. So I can get rid of image, and that's just as a result of, remember I took it out here in the previous one. So button inner had support for an image. We'll get rid of that because now we're not passing it down into button inner anymore because we're not passing it down into here. And so that means I can get rid of this image here. Now, I've got the data, but I've got this. This will help inform LitElement to make sure it does data binding correctly. Now, the thing it won't do in the same way is properties. And so it might, but let's look through. So my properties are typed, and they have the type definition. Now, this is a rare example of an element I've made where there aren't these additional decorators as to how to handle these types. So this is actually the same in this one instance between PolymerElement and LitElement. Where you get some differences, and let me see if I can find an example in here. It would be like this. So if there's a default value, so in this case, the HAXGizmo browser has a title that just says make. LitElement doesn't have a connotation of a default value. So instead, to get a default value into LitElement, you would do like this. You do a constructor, super, and then you do this dot title equals make. It's a subtle difference, but it actually, helps with performance and makes things a lot cleaner as far as the complexity of what this needs to do and maintain. So that's another one of those like things that you would convert when moving to LitElement from PolymerElement, but I didn't have to in this case. It's nice. So this area at the bottom is the same, right? This is going to change. I also have a tag, and I do static get tag on all of the elements I make. This is not actually part of the web component specification. It's just a convention I like using so that I can more easily reference or understand what the tags are and siphon them off. So I use this a lot internal to Hax and the way it works as far as hitting .tag and knowing what something's tag is. That's not an actual convention though, so I like to point that out. The last thing that needs updated is event binding. So there's this on click. And if you're familiar with writing JavaScript like this, it would be this if it was real JavaScript instead of JavaScript via a library. So on-click is not a real thing. That's a polymerism as far as getting that to bind to this function correctly. But if we look at LitElement with its event binding, we can see that the way it does events is like this. So that's a @ symbol and click. Now this could also start to be one of those like, do you think this is the way the platform will work? Ultimately, probably not, but it would be a lot easier down the road to do a search and replace for @click and bulk replace it with some method that, helps mix that in. But so the way I would upgrade this is I would do like this. Again, the nice having the syntax here of the template literals. Right, and in this case, it's going to do the binding correctly to fire event. Okay, so that was a lot of describing what ultimately should do the same thing. But let's see. So I'm going to inspect, make sure we don't end up with any nasty errors as a result of this, because I didn't check any of this ahead of time and literally just did it live now. So, all right, everything loads in. Let's do make tab. And sure enough, no errors. I have converted this appropriately. You see that the styles cascade through. We get the same way of doing that, and I can still have my data binding events, right? So I click paragraph, it opens up a paragraph to modify in context and put it down on the page. And so now I've converted what previously would have been, 20 or so of these elements on the page to a different library and could roll this out into production knowing it'll work everywhere because both libraries are built against the web component specification. That other library could be vanilla JavaScript, it could be Slim.js, it could be Svelte, it could be Ionix stencil system, it could be anything as long as it's compatible with web components. So this is a big part of what sold us as a team on this approach, being able to do this, right? Knowing that I still have the same UX patterns, accessibility, but now I've actually, through this little video, made Hax faster. And you might not be able to tell here, but I guarantee when it would get out the door, and we look at page weight, a year from now, Hax is going to weigh less than it does now. I know that's the case because it's going to keep using PolymerElement less and less. We're going to work towards designs that reduce complexity in the CSS or the JavaScript. That's going to influence accessibility to improve it. That's going to necessitate, oh, hey, we don't actually need all the training wheels of PolymerElement in this specific case. And you can see that the syntax between these two isn't radically different. Now, if I wanted a lot more mileage out of this as far as reducing page weight, right? Because this is a paper button. Paper button's built in PolymerElement still. I would replace that. Hax item button inner we looked at is actually built on something called simple colors. We're not going to get into. It's one of our own custom base classes, but Simple Colors is built on top of Polymer. So it's another neat and terrifying proposition of web components, right? Is class extension this way? I could extend into my own class. Now things start to rely on Simple Colors, but now they're wed to the way PolymerElement does its rendering. So something to keep in mind if you start leveraging your own base class all over the place. So I won't be able to reduce the complexity in that until I get it off of Simple Colors in this case, or come up with a new way that Simple Colors would be handled. So that's kind of an obnoxious issue, is one we'll tackle, we have slated to tackle in the next several months, is to be able to do the Hax shared styles, quote unquote, or Simple Color shared styles as it shows up here, but not have a dependence on PolymerElement. Something that would be great to do just in vanilla JavaScript, maybe wrap on PolymerElement via mixin or something, or have like Simple Colors PolymerElement, which is just a variation of Simple Colors specifically geared towards PolymerElement. Again, outside the scope of what we are solving for this video. So I hope that these have been informative as far as like what our process is and how we go about making changes and navigating all of our different repos. They literally all function this way. We end up following the exact same pattern no matter what we're trying to fix. And so now I'll have to go in and look, I have that little animation on there. So there's another piece where if I had the same component dictating this, I would now have all those gains, but in this aspect of the UI. So now I need to go through and fix it there, but it's less of an issue, right? There's something else where I could take that out. Another place I could take that out. Another place I could take that out, right? So as I normalize those pieces, and this starts to help, right? Like I take this, I go, oh, well, that should actually be the same button. I want it to function identically to this. Well, then that causes me to go, okay, let's refactor this into some other named element, put it in place here. When we render it, let's now have it dependent on LitElement. And now we're starting to infinitely reduce the complexity as far as the parts of the UI that this touches, right? Because we're doing it via web components and because we have a normalized approach for implementing these. So I will do those on my own time, at another point in time. The last thing I'll show in this last video is how we have this unified build pipeline so that basically we either work in the mono repo here as far as the issue queues as a team, or, and this is confusing for sure to a lot of people, when it's something specific to Hax, a lot of times we're actually working in HAXTheWeb. We're pushing that out to everything. So I'm going to show what our build step looks like that gets, you know, the new version of the HAX tag or Hax body in this case to be visible by webcomponents.org and npm.js, like how we go about getting that published over to npm.js from our mono repo, while not needing to be concerned that that's now in LitElement, right? We've got that out of the way. We also don't need to be concerned about how does Hax work in Drupal or WordPress or Backdrop or HAXTheWeb because of the way our pipeline works. So we'll pick up there with pipeline issues and why this approach that we have down has made us so stinking efficient.